Welcome back, everybody. This is part 4 on my series of video lectures dealing with the other attention disorder, now known as cognitive disengagement syndrome, but what used to be called sluggish cognitive tempo. In this part, we're going to take a look at the development of the symptoms over time and also at possible causes of CDS. So let's get started with my usual PowerPoint presentation here. Good. So studies, of which there are very few, have followed CDS children and ADHD children for a period of months and now up to at least 10 years. And what do they tell us about this condition? Well, first of all, we know that cross-sectional surveys of the U.S. population, which I did about a decade ago, in which we surveyed the population for CDS symptoms from ages 6 to 89, we found that there was very little change in the prevalence of CDS by age group across that period of time, almost none, suggesting that this condition, this attention deficit, is very stable across age groups. In contrast, as you know, ADHD, particularly its hyperactive symptoms, decline markedly with age, which is why we often see a change in the prevalence of ADHD by age group. We could talk more about that in another lecture, but suffice to say that at least cross-sectional studies looking at different age groups aren't seeing much change. And we find the same thing when we follow the same group of people up over time. There was initially a 2-year follow-up study, at least 2 of them anyway, that indicated very high stability of CDS symptoms across time. And that's great because, as I told you in the last lecture, we want to see this kind of more trait-like nature of CDS symptoms if we're going to view this as a disorder, as a condition. Because if it's more state-like, if it fluctuates markedly based on the situation, it's probably not a disorder and has more to do with the context, with situational circumstances. So these 2-year studies found that not only was there greater stability, but that initial CDS symptoms were predictive of greater occurrences of depressive symptoms at the 2-year follow-up. This was not predicted by the ADHD symptoms, particularly by ADHD inattentive, which is what that acronym you see on the slide means. They also found that there was a lower risk at follow-up of children having hyperactive and also oppositional defiant disorder symptoms. And I mentioned that earlier under comorbidity in an earlier lecture. CDS appears to not be related to hyperactivity or oppositional behavior at all. If anything, when the appropriate statistical controls are done, we see a negative relationship, meaning the higher your CDS symptoms, the less likely, even below typical people, you are to have those other symptoms. The initial CDS symptoms in these children also pointed to greater and distinct difficulties in the domains of social and academic functioning over time. And that's after controlling for whatever impairment ADHD symptoms might have been predicting. So that's very important. We're seeing that CDS predicts unique difficulties in the life course of individuals that cannot be explained by any overlap with ADHD symptoms. Another follow-up study looked at children going from age 3 up through grade 5, and it also, once again, found very stable occurrences of these symptoms in children, that they were distinct from the symptoms of ADHD, that there might even have been a modest increase in CDS symptoms with age of the children, something we don't see in ADHD, by the way, and that this was found in both parent and teacher reports. Later, there was a 9-year follow-up study that again showed high rates of stability and began to also show that CDS uniquely predicted higher rates of anxiety and depression, what psychologists call internalizing symptoms, by mid-adolescence. So yet again, more replication of not only stability, but of prediction of depressive and even anxiety symptoms over time. Then there were two studies that had followed children for over 10 years. And again, they also showed a very trait-like stability for CDS symptoms that was equivalent to what we see with ADHD inattentive symptoms. Not the same, but certainly the stability was there. And that CDS symptoms, once again, predicted higher rates of anxiety and depression at the 10-year follow-up. And again, this was not accounted for or predicted by inattention as we see in ADHD. There was also greater prediction of social withdrawal. And again, this was not predicted by the inattentive ADHD symptoms. And there was less externalizing problems. That's aggressive, oppositional, antisocial behavior associated with CDS. Those behaviors were more associated with ADHD symptoms, particularly greater ADHD inattention. Finally, these studies also showed that people with CDS seem to have greater reading problems than math problems. As I said in an earlier presentation, we thought that CDS might predict math problems, but that hasn't been found reliably, and this study didn't find that either. So to summarize, excellent stability of our symptoms over time, prediction of unique outcomes not explained by ADHD, specifically depression, anxiety, social withdrawal, and this lasting for up to 10 years or more. So looks like we have a trait, looks like we have a condition, a disorder here, not some situational problem. Now, what's causing CDS? Let's take a look. First of all, let's understand there's very, very little research on the etiologies of CDS. So it's very sparse, very limited. Let's take a quick look at what we do know. One study found that CDS symptoms were higher in children who have been exposed to prenatal alcohol use by their mothers, what you might call fetal alcohol exposure or fetal alcohol syndrome. So we know that ADHD symptoms are higher in those individuals as well, but this study suggested that some of that could be accounted for more by higher CDS symptoms. Another study found that children who were being treated for and had recovered from leukemia had higher than usual rates of CDS. That's interesting because some earlier studies thought that ADHD was more common during the recovery of children from being treated for their acute lymphoblastic leukemia. That still could be the case, but that study didn't even look for CDS, the other attention disorder. It's possible now that leukemia and its treatments could be resulting in more CDS than ADHD symptoms. We'll have to wait for more research to see. But here again, we're seeing that neurological injuries as a result of brain toxins, alcohol, leukemia, and the treatments being used to recover children from leukemia may well be producing CDS symptoms. Now, let's go over and look at what's called psychophysiology, measures of bodily activity, particularly electrical activity. There was a study in China published just 2 years ago that showed that looked at heart rate variability. And what it found is that resting heart rate variability was greater in individuals with higher CDS symptoms. And it also showed that there was a greater increase in heart rate variability in response to a warning stimulus to get ready for something that was about to happen. That was also linked to CDS. Now, what does that mean to us? We see this kind of heart rate variability in people who are more likely to be anxious or very sensitive to the potential occurrence of negative consequences like punishment. Excuse me. So this is suggesting there's something about CDS that's linking up with the body's reactivity to threat, to warning signs of punishment, to stress. We're going to see that again as well in some subsequent studies that looked at skin conductance. Excuse me. Skin conductance is how readily does an electrical impulse move through the skin. So they test it with very light levels of electricity and look at how much it passes through. So what this study found is very similar to the heart rate study. This found that both sinus arrhythmias and skin conductance were related to CDS symptoms, and that there was higher reactivity in skin conductance in individuals with CDS symptoms, and that this was also related to social rejection, but was not related to the performance of non-social tasks. So there's something here indicating greater reactivity of the behavioral inhibition system, which is not what we see in ADHD. We see the opposite. ADHD is associated with lower reactivity in the inhibitory system. Again, all suggesting that there's something about this disorder that's related to stress, possibly to anxiety, and certainly to threats in the environment, perceived threats of impending punishment. Now, there are a couple of studies that looked at the EEG, brain electrical activity, and they found that CDS was linked to a reduced electrical response at about 100 milliseconds after the potential had occurred, that is, after the event had occurred, and that was linked to CDS, or what is called SCT in this study. ADHD, on the other hand, was linked to problems at about 300 milliseconds in brain activity. So the two disorders are linked to different problems in brain activation. One very early at the level of sensory detection, and another later in the frontal lobe where the 300 millisecond ERP is often detected. So again, some differences here in electrical activity. I don't want to make too much about it. There was another study of EEG that found focal slow wave or sleep-like patterns in the posterior parts of the brain in people with higher CDS type symptoms. That is, those who reported more mind blanking, sluggish responding, and who appeared to miss more targets on a computerized attention task. So all of that was linked to CDS symptoms. On the other hand, frontal slow wave activity was linked more to mind wandering rather than mind blanking. And then here's a really neat image from a study. This study looked at the EEG across the scalp and compared the EEG during instances where people reported mind wandering, people reported mind blanking, which is basically thinking of nothing, and then compared the two conditions, that is, instances of mind wandering with instances of mind blanking. And what does it show? Well, first of all, during mind wandering, it shows this sort of pervasive pattern of activity in what is called the default mode network of the brain, which is over here principally in the middle and posterior sections of the brain, and especially over on the left side. But so we're seeing that mind wandering is associated with one kind of brain activity. Mind blanking, on the other hand, was associated with decreased patterns of activation in the frontal areas, and here you see in these midline areas. So the lighter the colors, the less activation that was seen. So we're seeing more activation in default mode network with mind wandering and less activation of very focal areas of the brain in mind blanking. And you see that when you compare the two, in other words, you subtract one from the other, mind blanking is very much associated with reduced activity. Indeed, what this shows is that during mind blanking, certain areas of the brain, of the cortex, are going to sleep. Not the whole brain, just very specific regions of the brain appear to be shutting down and moving into a more sleep-like pattern. And we don't see any of this in ADHD at all. Excuse me. A couple of neuroimaging studies have been done. The largest to date, done with a large sample of children in Spain, showed that CDS symptoms were associated with greater brain volume, particularly in the frontal lobes, and less mature connectivity between the frontal lobes and elsewhere than was seen in ADHD and even after controlling for ADHD. Now, that's interesting because we see the opposite in ADHD when it comes to brain volume. ADHD is associated with a little bit less gray matter in the brain, particularly in childhood, whereas we're seeing here CDS is associated with more brain volume. You probably don't know this, but that result is consistent with the overlap of CDS symptoms with autism spectrum symptoms. Because in autism, we also see greater brain volume and too much local connectivity within that brain and not enough long-range functional connectivity of those brain areas to other areas around the brain. And that's rather common in autism spectrum, and we're beginning to see some overlap of those kinds of neurologic problems with CDS symptoms. And again, very different than what we see in ADHD. A couple of other neuroimaging studies found that CDS symptoms were linked to activation of the default mode network and its functional connectivity throughout the brain. Boy, does that go along with that study on mind wandering that I just reported to you earlier in that graph. It also found that overreactivity, greater brain volume, and connectivity were found in people who reported being lonely, socially isolated, more prone to engaging in mental fantasy, mental simulations of social situations, and more rumination. All of that would be consistent with CDS or SCT symptoms than with ADHD symptoms. ADHD, in contrast, is associated with more dysfunction in the executive networks in the brain, and that can create some secondary problems in managing the default mode network. But the problem isn't in the default mode network. It's in its management during goal-directed activity. It's more of a top-down executive regulation of the mind-wandering network that we see in ADHD. In case you're not familiar with it, that default mode network is in a very different part of the brain. It's pretty much here in these posterior parietal temporal areas, a little bit of activity up in the prefrontal lobe. But as you can see here, this is a cross-section of the brain from the top down. The default mode network is in the back part of the brain with a little bit of connection up here to the front part of the brain. What are we seeing in CDS? This part of the brain is overactive relative to other individuals. In ADHD, what we see is that the front part of the brain is not particularly active and therefore isn't regulating the default mode network. If I could simplify it, CDS seems to be associated with kind of a renegade default mode network that's overactive and not being controlled very well by the frontal lobe. ADHD is associated more with executive dysfunction, and that's leading to a secondary problem with regulating the mind-wandering default mode network. Finally, just a couple of studies on genetics here. We have hundreds of studies on the genetics of ADHD. One study looked at the heritability of CDS symptoms. How much does genetics contribute to CDS? And it found that there was a strong genetic contribution to CDS symptoms. About 60 to 60% of the variance was explained by genetics in CDS symptoms. That figure is higher in ADHD, about 0.76, 76% heritability. So again, very strong heritability here. Genetics is contributing to both disorders, but perhaps a little bit more to ADHD than it is to CDS. Instead, this study found that there were unique events in the lives of individuals. Unique events are things that occur to one child in a family but not to the others, and that seemed to account for more variance in CDS, whereas we often see a lot less contribution of that in ADHD symptoms. So there is some linkage of CDS to unusual, unique environmental events. By the way, environmental events can be neurological, exposure to head injury, leukemia, prenatal alcohol exposure, anything not genetic that's unique to that child. And then it also found that there was some shared liability between the two forms of inattention. In other words, the genes contributing to ADHD inattention, some of those genes might also be contributing to CDS inattention. But the study also found that there were unique genetic contributions to each of these attention disorders. And that's important to show. They're not the same, but they could have some overlap. One study in Turkey looked at some specific genes, particularly the dopamine, the DRD4 gene, and it found that it was more common in people with ADHD, that is the 4 repeat sequence of that gene, whereas the 7 repeat sequence was more common in CDS. Again, it's just one study, but suggesting that different genetic variants in dopamine genes could be explaining these differences in these attention deficits. But again, one study doesn't make a conclusion. I'll remind you that we also found that CDS in my own studies of the U.S. population was linked more to psychosocial adversity within the family than was the case for ADHD. Both of them are linked to that, but CDS was even more strongly related to adversity. So perhaps there's something about exposure to chronic environmental stress and events that might be linked to CDS. We'll see. So that's about what we know about causation. Now, in the next lecture, we're going to talk about just what is going on in cognitive disengagement syndrome. So join me for that next lecture. Thank you.